the store gleamed with wealth. Every polished surface reflected luxury, gold-trimmed shelves, glass display cases filled with exclusive items, and a scent of expensive cologne lingering in the air. The kind of place where only the ultra-rich shopped, where an average person wouldn't dare step inside unless they wanted to empty their savings in a single purchase. A well-dressed businessman strutted through the grand entrance, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor. He wore an expensive suit, custom-tailored to fit his frame, and a designer watch that screamed power and success. With every step, his posture oozed arrogance. People like him didn't browse. They demanded. His eyes scanned the store, unimpressed, until they landed on the cashier, behind the counter. A simple man. No expensive suit, no designer watch, just a plain uniform and an unbothered expression. Unlike the nervous employees who scurried around catering to customers, this one stood there calmly, hands resting on the counter, watching everything unfold with quiet amusement. The businessman narrowed his eyes. Something about the cashier's demeanor irritated him. There was no eagerness, no desperation to serve or impress, just an annoying confidence that felt out of place. With a smug smirk, he strolled up to the counter. "What's the most expensive thing in this store?" he asked, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The cashier didn't even blink. "Depends on what you're looking for." The businessman scoffed. "Figures. A cashier wouldn't know. You probably don't even belong in a place like this." The words hung in the air, sharp and condescending. Nearby, an employee froze mid-step, eyes darting nervously between the two men. But the cashier? He remained unfazed. "Belonging is a funny thing," he said with a faint smile. "It's not always about what you wear or how much you spend." The businessman chuckled, shaking his head. "Listen, pal, people like you work for people like me. You take orders, not give lectures. So why don't you do your job and point me to the luxury section?" A few customers nearby shifted uncomfortably. Even the store manager, who had been talking to a high-profile client, turned his head toward the commotion. Still, the cashier remained calm. If anything, there was something almost amused in his eyes, as if he knew something the businessman didn't. "Luxury sections that way," he finally said, gesturing toward the back of the store. The businessman scoffed again. "About time." He turned to leave, but then paused. Something inside him itched to go further. To push a little more. "People like you are why this world is divided," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Too comfortable being nobodies." This time, the air in the store shifted. The tension was no longer subtle. Several employees exchanged anxious glances, and the manager took a step forward as if preparing to intervene. Yet, the cashier still didn't react the way most would. No anger. No embarrassment. Instead, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. And then, he spoke. "You might want to be careful with assumptions," he said casually. "They have a way of making people look foolish." The businessman frowned. His smirk faltered, just for a second. There was something about the way the cashier spoke. It wasn't a defensive comeback. It wasn't irritation. It was something else. Something unsettling. For the first time since entering the store, the businessman hesitated. Who exactly was this cashier? And why did it feel like he wasn't the one in control of this conversation? The businessman's smirk wavered. He prided himself on his ability to read people, to assess their worth in a glance. And this cashier? He should have been easy to dismiss, just another nobody in a cheap uniform, barely making enough to afford a meal at one of the restaurants the businessman dined in daily. Yet something was off. There was no nervousness, no stuttering, no desperation to please. Most cashiers either groveled for tips or avoided confrontation. But this one? He looked him straight in the eye, calm and collected, as if he had nothing to prove. The businessman wasn't used to that. It irritated him. "I think you misunderstood me," he said, taking a step closer. His voice was quieter now, but the condescension was still thick. I wasn't asking for advice. I was making a point. People like you should learn to stay in your lane. The cashier tilted his head, unfazed. And what lane is that, exactly? The businessman scoffed. The one where you serve and I buy. The one where you say yes, sir, and move aside while real players make the decisions. A few nearby employees pretended to be busy, but their ears were clearly tuned in. A well-dressed woman browsing handbags hesitated, glancing between the two men. Even the security guard standing near the entrance seemed to be paying attention now. Still, the cashier didn't back down. I see, he said thoughtfully. And what exactly qualifies you to be in this higher lane of yours? The businessman let out a dry chuckle. Money, for one. Power, for another. Influence, connections, you name it. He spread his arms as if inviting everyone in the store to acknowledge his greatness. People like me keep the world running. People like you are just extras in the background. The words were sharp, meant to cut deep. But the cashier? He smiled. Not the kind of forced smile employees gave to rude customers. This one had something else behind it, amusement. So, in your world, the cashier said slowly, your value is measured by your bank account? The businessman shrugged. That's how it works. The cashier nodded, as if considering this. Interesting. The businessman crossed his arms. And what do you have to show for yourself? You stand behind a counter. Probably making minimum wage, and yet you talk to me like we're equals. He chuckled. That's cute. The store manager, who had been lurking nearby, finally stepped forward. Sir, he said, glancing nervously at the businessman, perhaps we can assist you with something else? The businessman smirked, satisfied. Finally, someone who knew their place. But the cashier raised an eyebrow. You seem worried, he said to the manager. Why is that? The manager hesitated. He looked between the businessman and the cashier, his mouth opening and closing like he wasn't sure what to say. The businessman noticed the reaction and frowned. What's going on here? The manager quickly cleared his throat. Nothing, sir. The businessman cut him off. Good. Because I want this guy fired. He pointed at the cashier. I don't appreciate being disrespected by people who work for me. The store fell silent. The cashier exhaled, still annoyingly calm. You want me fired? Absolutely, the businessman said, emboldened. Consider this a lesson in knowing your place. He turned back to the manager. Well? What are you waiting for? The manager swallowed hard. Sir, I don't think that would be a good idea. The businessman blinked. Excuse me? There was another uncomfortable pause. And then the security guard, who had been watching the entire thing unfold, took a step closer. The businessman expected him to escort the cashier out. Instead, the guard gave the businessman a long, measured look. You sure about this, sir? He asked. The businessman bristled. Of course, I'm sure. What kind of store allows their employees to act like this? He should be begging for his job, not smirking at me like he owns the place. The cashier let out a low chuckle. For the first time, the businessman felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Doubt. He turned back to the manager. Well? The manager exhaled slowly. Sir. I really think you should reconsider. The businessman's patience snapped. Reconsider? You've got to be joking. Then, something strange happened. The manager and the security guard exchanged a look. A look that the businessman didn't understand. A look that made something shift in the atmosphere of the store. You really don't recognize him, do you? The manager finally asked. The businessman frowned. Recognize him? What the hell are you talking about? The cashier leaned forward slightly. You spent all this time talking about status, power, and money, but you never stopped to ask who I am. For the first time, a sliver of unease crept into the businessman's chest. He stared at the cashier, really looking at him this time. Something about the face, the voice, it was familiar. Not in the way that suggested a past meeting, but in the way that suggested he should know who this was. No. That was impossible. This was just some nobody. A cashier working a register in a luxury store. Right? A cold chuckle from the cashier made the businessman flinch. You walked in here thinking you were the most important person in the room, the cashier said. And yet, you never stopped to consider that maybe, just maybe, you were the least important one. The businessman's stomach twisted. For the first time in his life, he wasn't in control of the situation. And he had a sinking feeling that he was about to learn why the businessman's smug confidence wavered. The air in the store was different now. It wasn't just the curious stares from other customers or the uncomfortable glances from the staff. It was something deeper. A shift in power. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one controlling the situation. His fingers tightened into a fist. What the hell is this? He snapped. Why is everyone looking at me like that? No one answered. The store manager took a deep breath and looked at the cashier, the one who had been insulted, humiliated, and yet, never lost his cool. Sir, the manager began hesitantly, his voice tight. I strongly advise that I don't give a damn about your advice. The businessman interrupted. This is ridiculous. What is wrong with you people? Why is this idiot still standing here? The cashier, still unfazed, simply tilted his head slightly. There was something in his eyes. A quiet, steady confidence that unsettled the businessman. The security guard took a step forward, his stance calm but firm. Sir, he said, his deep voice carrying a weight that made the businessman's heartbeat quicken, I think you need to listen. The businessman let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. Oh, this is priceless. Listen to what? Some nobody behind a register? Are you serious? The cashier finally moved. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, high-end phone. Without a word, he tapped a number, placed the phone to his ear, and waited. The businessman rolled his eyes. Oh, so now you're making calls? Who are you gonna call, huh? The CEO of this place? He let out a sharp, cruel laugh. Go ahead. Let's see how fast they fire you. The cashier didn't react. He simply spoke into the phone. It's me, he said smoothly. Yeah, I'm at the store. Silence. Then, the businessman noticed something strange. The store manager, who had been on edge this entire time, suddenly straightened up. His face went pale. His hands trembled slightly as he looked at the cashier's phone like it held the secrets of the universe. The businessman frowned. What's going on? The cashier didn't respond. Instead, he handed the phone to the store manager. Here, the cashier said calmly. They want to talk to you. The manager hesitated, but when he took the phone, his hands were shaking. He pressed it to his ear. Yes, sir, he said quickly, nodding like a schoolboy in front of a principal. No, sir. I wasn't aware. Yes. Understood. Right away. The businessman's stomach twisted as he watched the manager nod repeatedly, sweat forming at his temple. This wasn't right. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The manager handed the phone back, swallowing hard. I had no idea, sir. I sincerely apologize. Apologize? For what? The businessman's patience snapped. Enough of this nonsense, he barked. Someone explain what's going on, or I'll have every single one of you fired. No one moved. The store manager didn't even look at him. The security guard remained still, his expression unreadable. Only the cashier was looking at him now. And then, the words came. The words that changed everything. You don't recognize me, do you? The businessman scoffed. Why the hell would I recognize you? You're a damn cashier. The cashier let out a small chuckle. Is that so? Then, slowly, painfully slow, he reached up and removed the store's name tag from his chest. And then he spoke 4 words. 4 words that made the businessman's world tilt on its axis. My name is Elon Musk. Silence. Complete, deafening silence. The businessman blinked, sure he had misheard. No. No, that wasn't possible. It had to be a joke. His lips parted to argue, but something in the way the store manager's eyes widened told him that this wasn't a prank. Then he heard it. A soft gasp from a woman standing nearby. A murmur from another customer. One of the employees covered her mouth in shock. Then the whispers started. Elon Musk? No way, that's not, wait, is it? The businessman felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Panic. Real, tangible panic. His heart pounded. His mind raced. His mouth went dry. Elon Musk. The billionaire. The CEO of Tesla, SpaceX, and more companies than he could count. The man with a net worth that made even the richest businessmen look small. And he had just spent the last 15 minutes insulting him. Mocking him. Telling him he was a nobody. He could feel the blood draining from his face. His entire body felt cold. Elon Musk watched him calmly, his expression unreadable. The businessman tried to laugh, but it came out weak and strangled. Why, you're joking, right? Elon simply raised an eyebrow. The businessman forced a smile. Come on, man. You don't expect me to believe that, do you? Elon Musk pulled out his phone again. He tapped on the screen, then turned it around. It was a live news feed. His face. Elon Musk's face. The same one standing in front of him right now. The businessman's knees nearly buckled. This wasn't a joke. This was real. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He had just humiliated one of the richest and most powerful men in the world. And he had done it publicly. Elon Musk slid his phone back into his pocket and crossed his arms. Well, he said simply. Now what? The businessman had no answer. Because for the first time in his life, he was the one with nothing. The businessman stood frozen, his mind spiraling. He had spent his entire life in control, towering over others with wealth and power. But now, in a matter of minutes, the balance had shifted completely. Elon Musk. The name alone sent a chill down his spine. The man he had mocked, humiliated, and dismissed as a nobody was, in reality, one of the richest and most influential people in the world. He had more money than entire countries, controlled billion-dollar corporations, and had a level of influence that could change industries overnight. And the businessman had just spent the last 15 minutes making a fool of himself in front of him. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He struggled to find words, any words, that could fix this, but his mind was blank. The weight of the silence around him was unbearable. Every eye in the store was on him. Employees stood motionless, customers whispered among themselves, and the store manager looked as if he were about to faint. Even the security guard, who had previously been ready to escort the cashier out, now stood respectfully at a distance, watching the scene unfold with careful attention. Finally, Elon broke the silence. You were saying something about status? He said casually, his voice calm but cutting. The businessman swallowed hard. I didn't know, he stammered, his confidence cracking like fragile glass. Elon tilted his head. Didn't know what? The businessman felt his pulse hammering. I didn't know who you were. A slight smirk appeared on Elon's face. Ah. So if I had actually been a regular cashier, your behavior would have been acceptable? The businessman's throat went dry. No, Elon didn't let him finish. You walked into this store, looked at me, and decided that because I was standing behind a counter, I was beneath you. His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now. You didn't ask my name. You didn't ask what I did. You didn't ask anything at all. You just assumed. The businessman's hands clenched into fists. This was bad. Very bad. You talked a lot about power and influence earlier, Elon continued, crossing his arms. You said that people like me, he motioned to his cashier uniform, work for people like you. The businessman's stomach twisted. Elon's eyes darkened. But what happens when it turns out that the person you're insulting could buy and sell everything you own? The businessman felt the blood drain from his face. He had built his career on networking, making deals, and rubbing shoulders with the right people. He had prided himself on his ability to make connections that mattered. But this? This was a disaster. One word from Elon Musk, and his name could be blacklisted from every major business circle. No invitations to exclusive investment meetings. No lucrative partnerships. No high-stakes negotiations where he could flex his financial power. If Elon decided to ruin him, he could. And there would be nothing he could do to stop it. A bead of sweat trickled down the businessman's temple. His arrogant smirk was long gone. Listen, he started, his voice quieter now, no longer booming with authority. I didn't mean any offense. It was a misunderstanding, a misunderstanding? Elon repeated, raising an eyebrow. The businessman nodded quickly, desperate to salvage the situation. Yes. I thought you were just an employee here, so I may have come off a little strong, but it wasn't personal. Elon chuckled. A slow, knowing chuckle. So let me get this straight, he said. If I had actually been a cashier, you would have treated me like garbage. But since I happen to be a billionaire, now you regret it? The businessman flinched. That's not what you don't need to explain, Elon said, his voice neutral but sharp. Your actions already did that for you. The businessman swallowed hard. He could feel himself losing ground fast. He had never cared about cashiers before. Never thought twice about speaking down to people he deemed insignificant. But now? Now he was desperate for Elon to believe he wasn't a terrible person. Elon studied him for a long moment before shaking his head. You know what's funny? He said, looking around the store. I wasn't even planning to be here today. I just wanted to see how people react when they think someone has no power. The businessman's stomach twisted into knots. Elon turned to the store manager. I assume this guy is a frequent customer? The manager hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. Elon exhaled through his nose. Figures. Then, he did something that made the businessman's entire body tense. He pulled out his phone. The businessman's eyes widened. Wait, Elon held up a finger, silencing him. A moment later, he put the phone to his ear. Hey, he said smoothly. Yeah, I'm at the store. No issues. Just an interesting experience. A pause. The businessman felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the final push. Then Elon glanced at him, amusement flickering in his eyes. Yeah, he said into the phone. I think I'll buy the company. The businessman nearly choked. The entire store fell silent. The manager's mouth dropped open. The security guard blinked. The businessman felt his chest tighten. You're joking, right? The businessman stammered. Elon smirked. I don't joke about investments. The businessman's mind reeled. If Elon Musk bought this luxury brand, he wouldn't just be rich, he'd be in charge. And that meant. The businessman gasped. Please, he blurted, his voice shaking. I made a mistake. I didn't know. I wasn't thinking, Elon held up his hand. You weren't thinking because you didn't have to, he said. People like you are used to stepping on others without consequences. But the thing is. He slid his phone back into his pocket. There are consequences. The businessman felt lightheaded. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't how things worked. He was the one who humiliated others, not the other way around. He was the one with the power. But now, standing in front of Elon Musk, all of that meant nothing. Elon looked him up and down before speaking again. "You have a lot to think about," he said simply. "I hope this experience teaches you something." Then, without another word, he turned to the store manager and motioned toward the register. "I'll take everything in the store," he said. The businessman felt his world collapsing. He had spent his entire life believing money made him untouchable. But today, he had learned the hard way. Power isn't about how much you have. It's about how you use it. The businessman stood motionless, his mind desperately trying to grasp the reality of what had just happened. Elon Musk was buying the entire store. Not just a few products. Not just a section. Everything. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The store manager, still reeling from the revelation, swallowed hard. His hands trembled slightly as he nodded and quickly instructed the employees to begin processing the massive transaction. The businessman watched in horror as staff scrambled to scan and pack the most expensive merchandise, designer watches, luxury handbags, rare collector's items. Everything was being pulled off the shelves. Elon Musk wasn't just making a statement. He was erasing any lingering doubt about who truly held the power here. The businessman took a deep breath, his arrogance cracking. He needed to fix this, fast. He cleared his throat and forced an awkward chuckle. "Look, Mr. Musk." Elon turned to face him, raising an eyebrow. The businessman hesitated. That calm, unreadable expression made him nervous. It was like staring into the eyes of a man who had already won a battle he didn't even know had started. I think we got off on the wrong foot," the businessman continued, shifting uncomfortably. "I didn't mean anything by what I said earlier. Just a bit of friendly banter, you know?" Elon didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied him for a long moment, then let out a small chuckle. "Friendly banter?" he repeated. The businessman nodded eagerly. "Exactly. Just harmless words." Elon sighed and crossed his arms. "You really don't get it, do you?" The businessman's forced smile wavered. Elon took a step closer, his tone casual but sharp. "I don't care that you insulted me," he said. "I've been underestimated my whole life. People have called me crazy, stupid, reckless, you name it. None of that matters to me." The businessman blinked in confusion. "Then, what matters," Elon continued, cutting him off, "is that you didn't hesitate to humiliate someone you thought was beneath you. That wasn't banter. That wasn't harmless." The businessman's jaw tightened. "You walked in here and judged me instantly," Elon said. "Not based on intelligence. Not based on character. Just because I was wearing a uniform." He paused, letting the words sink in. "That's how you treat people when you think they can't fight back." The businessman's heart pounded. Elon's expression didn't change, but there was an intensity behind his words that made the businessman feel small, something he hadn't felt in years. "You see," Elon continued, "money doesn't make a person valuable. Power doesn't make someone better. The way you treat people when they have nothing to offer you?" His eyes locked onto the businessman's. "That's who you really are." A heavy silence followed. The businessman felt like the entire store was closing in on him. For the first time in his life, he was speechless. His mind scrambled for a response, some way to regain control, but nothing came. Because deep down, he knew Elon was right. He had always been that way. Always looked down on people. Always measured worth by wealth. But now, standing in front of someone who truly had everything, it was painfully clear. He had nothing. He had money, yes. He had luxury, status, recognition. But if all of that disappeared tomorrow, what would be left? Nothing. Because no one respected him. They feared him. They tolerated him. But they didn't respect him. And in this moment, as he stood before Elon Musk, a man who could ruin his entire career with a single phone call, he understood something terrifying. He didn't respect himself either. The businessman swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat. For the first time in decades, he felt something foreign, something unsettling. Regret. Elon watched him carefully, as if waiting for a response. But the businessman had none. Because for the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. The businessman stood frozen in place, his mind still trying to process the weight of what had just happened. He had always believed himself to be untouchable. His wealth, his influence, his ability to control conversations and dictate outcomes, it had always been his power. But standing in front of Elon Musk, the power dynamic had shifted in a way he had never experienced before. For the first time in his life, his money meant nothing. The luxury store was silent except for the quiet rustling of employees continuing to pack the expensive merchandise for Elon's massive purchase. The businessman could feel the weight of their gazes, some were watching with quiet satisfaction, others with awe, but none with the deference he had grown accustomed to. Even the security guard, who had initially seemed like he would support him, now stood motionless, his face unreadable. The businessman swallowed hard. He had to say something. Anything. He hesitated, clearing his throat. I think there's been a misunderstanding. Elon raised an eyebrow, his arms still crossed as he waited. The businessman forced a chuckle, though it sounded thin, hollow. I wasn't trying to offend you. You were just what? Elon asked, his voice calm but firm. The businessman hesitated. He didn't have an answer. Elon continued. Were you just testing how much disrespect a cashier would tolerate? Were you just reminding someone you assumed was less successful than you that they'd never be on your level? The businessman stiffened. That's not what I meant. But that's exactly what you did. Elon shook his head slightly. And what's worse, you only regret it now because you found out who I am. The businessman opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because Elon was right. If he had been a real cashier, he wouldn't have cared. He wouldn't have given a second thought to his words. How many times had he done this before? To waiters, clerks, assistants, employees, people he considered beneath him? He had never regretted it. Not once. But now that the man he insulted had the power to destroy him? Now he cared. That realization burned deep. Elon exhaled through his nose and glanced at the store manager, who was still pale from the shock of the situation. How often does this guy come in here? The manager swallowed. Fairly regularly, sir. Elon nodded. And how does he usually treat your employees? The businessman's stomach dropped. The manager hesitated, clearly torn between answering honestly and protecting an important customer. Elon tilted his head. Tell the truth. The businessman clenched his fists. The manager finally sighed. He's not exactly polite, sir. A few employees exchanged knowing looks. Some nodded. A few muttered under their breath. The businessman felt exposed in a way he never had before. Elon turned back to him. See? This isn't about me. The businessman felt his throat tighten. He had never been called out like this. Never been put in a position where he was the one being judged. But now, standing under the weight of Elon's scrutiny, he felt small. Because for the first time, there were no excuses. He could lie to himself all he wanted. He could tell himself that this was just a misunderstanding. That he had gotten caught up in the moment. But deep down, he knew the truth. This was who he was. And now, everyone could see it. The businessman forced himself to stand straighter, trying to regain some semblance of control. Look, he said carefully, I understand I may have come off a little strong, but let's not blow this out of proportion. We're both businessmen, we both know that in life, people say things they don't mean. Elon studied him for a long moment before speaking. What do you actually want from this conversation? The businessman hesitated. Did he want forgiveness? A chance to save face? Or did he just want to escape the consequences? He exhaled. I don't want any trouble. Elon chuckled. Trouble? He gestured around the store. You're the one who walked in here looking for trouble. I was standing here, minding my business, and you made it your mission to humiliate me. The businessman's face burned with shame. Elon's voice softened slightly. I have nothing to prove to you. My success isn't based on how much I belittle people. But yours? He let the question linger. The businessman felt the weight of it. For years, he had built his reputation on dominance. He was feared. Respected. No one challenged him. But Elon Musk, a man whose success was unmatched, didn't have to resort to cruelty. He didn't have to remind people of their place. Because he didn't need to. And that's what made him truly powerful. The businessman had spent his life demanding respect, but had never truly earned it. Elon sighed. I don't think you're a bad person. I think you're a person who never had to question himself. The businessman swallowed hard. I don't need an apology, Elon said finally. Because I don't care about the words you say to me now. What matters is what you do after this. The businessman blinked. What does that mean? Elon tilted his head slightly. It means people are watching. Your employees, your clients, your business partners. They see how you treat people. The businessman's stomach churned. You don't have to impress me, Elon continued. I'm not going to blacklist you. I'm not going to ruin your career. That would be too easy. The businessman's breath caught. No punishment? No public humiliation? Elon took a step back. But you are going to leave this store knowing that your power isn't what you thought it was. The businessman couldn't move. Everything inside him screamed to regain control. To flip the situation back in his favor. But he couldn't. Because he had already lost. And the worst part? Elon wasn't the one who had taken his power away. He had done it to himself. The businessman felt something foreign stir inside him, shame. Real, unfiltered shame. Because deep down, he knew. This moment would stay with him forever. Elon exhaled. I hope you change. I really do. Then, without another word, he turned back to the cashier's counter, leaving the businessman standing there, exposed, vulnerable, and for the first time in his life, truly humbled. The businessman stood in stunned silence, his world unraveling around him. Everything he had built, his wealth, his status, his influence, none of it mattered in this moment. He had always believed that money equaled power. That those with wealth dictated the rules of the world. That people who stood behind counters, waiting tables, or working in service jobs were beneath him. But today, in a cruel twist of fate, he was the one made to feel small. And it wasn't because Elon Musk had humiliated him. It was because he had humiliated himself. Elon hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened him. He hadn't retaliated in anger. He had simply held up a mirror. And for the first time, the businessman didn't like what he saw. The employees were still watching, their faces unreadable. Customers whispered among themselves. The store manager stood nervously behind the counter, unsure of what to do next. Elon, on the other hand, looked completely at peace. He had nothing to prove. Because true power didn't come from money. It came from how you treated others when you had nothing to gain. The businessman swallowed hard, his throat dry. His entire life had been about winning deals, winning arguments, winning respect through dominance. But now, he felt like he had lost something bigger than any business deal. He had lost his own dignity. He had walked into this store, believing himself to be superior. And yet, as he looked at Elon Musk, a man who had more success than he could ever dream of, he realized something startling. Elon didn't need to prove his worth by stepping on others. And that was what separated them. For years, the businessman had mistaken fear for respect. People feared him. They tolerated him. They obeyed him. But they didn't respect him. Because respect couldn't be bought. It couldn't be demanded. It had to be earned. And for the first time in his life, he realized he had never earned it. Elon turned back to him one last time, as if reading his thoughts. "Do you know why I didn't fire back at you?" he asked. The businessman blinked, unsure of how to respond. Elon smiled slightly. "Because I don't need to. People who are truly successful don't waste energy proving it." The businessman flinched. Elon continued. "You thought this was about money. But the truth is, money just reveals who people really are. If you're kind when you're rich, you were always kind. If you're cruel, you were always cruel." The businessman felt his stomach tighten. Elon sighed and shook his head. "I've been poor. I've been laughed at. People have doubted me at every step. But I never needed to put others down to feel important." The businessman looked down at his hands. When was the last time he had earned anyone's respect? Not through money. Not through intimidation. But through his own actions? He couldn't remember. The realization felt like a punch to the gut. Elon glanced at the cashier uniform he was still wearing, then back at the businessman. "You don't have to be a billionaire to treat people with dignity. That's free." The businessman felt the weight of those words settle deep into his chest. He had spent his life believing power meant stepping on others. But today, he had been the one stepped on, not by force, not by humiliation, but by the sheer weight of his own mistakes. Elon had given him a choice. He could leave this store, pretend nothing happened, continue his life unchanged. Or he could let this moment define something greater. He took a shaky breath. His heart pounded in his chest. For the first time in decades, he felt like a student. Like someone who had just learned something truly valuable. Elon gave him one last look. "I hope this isn't just another bad day for you. I hope it's the day you start doing better." With that, he turned and walked toward the exit, leaving the businessman standing there, alone with his thoughts. The employees began to disperse, returning to their tasks. The whispers from the customers faded. The security guard relaxed his stance. The world moved on. But the businessman? He was forever changed. As he stood there in the silence of the luxury store, surrounded by the very wealth he had once worshipped, he realized something painful. Money had never been the true measure of success. Character was. And today, he had seen his own character for what it really was. Flawed. Weak. But not beyond repair. He turned toward the nearest employee, the same ones he had spent years ignoring. The ones he had never once thanked. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "Hey," the employee hesitated, eyes wary. The businessman swallowed hard. He had never apologized to anyone before. But now, for the first time, he felt like he needed to. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For everything." The employee looked stunned. The store manager paused, watching him closely. Even the security guard raised an eyebrow. The businessman meant it. Because today, for the first time, he had finally understood what it meant to be truly rich. And it had nothing to do with money.